Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. It's election day in the US and swing state Michigan is in the spotlight. Michigan has the country's highest proportion of Arab Americans and was once a Democratic stronghold. But frustrations over America's unconditional support for Israel's war on Gaza means that in Michigan, the race between Kamala Herris and Donald Trump is impossibly close. Now, joining us on the show now to give us a little perspective of the sentiment in Michigan is Professor Saeed Khan, who's a founding member of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. He's also an associate professor of Near Eastern and Asian Studies at Wayne State University. Saeed, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I appreciate your time. Talk to me a little bit about the factors that have turned Michigan into a battleground state, knowing that previously it had been a Democratic stronghold in the past.
Well, we've had this shift toward what now can be called a battleground state for several election cycles. Part of that is because Michigan has been losing population fairly steadily over the past few decades. Being a manufacturing hub at one time, we find that new economies, particularly in South and Southwest US, have caused many people to shift from here. So a declining population has been unhelpful, but at the same time, there's a lot of disillusionment in what had been the strength of labor and trade unions here, which were always very reliable Democratic voters. We find now, for several reasons, including social conservative reasons, that there is the erosion of support even in those working class sectors of Michigan society. More recently, though, of course, we find that because, as you rightly said, Michigan has the largest concentration of Arabs outside the Middle East, a very complex and a very vibrant community, but one that has become increasingly frustrated and disillusioned by the Biden administration's categorical support for Israel, with very few conciliatory remarks and certainly very few policy initiatives which would appear to provide balance. As a result of that, we see that a fairly healthy segment of the Arab and Muslim community is considering a third-party vote this year, particularly that of Jill Stein, who has on her ticket as vice president Bilal Rudolph Ware, an African-American Muslim academic who has ties to Michigan. He used to teach at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor before his current appointment at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So all of these factors are, I should say, some of the factors which are causing the Arab and the Muslim vote to start to shift away from really the two traditional parties.
Well, talk to me about the third-party candidate, Jill Stein. There's been talk that usually third-party candidates are seen as potential spoilers, splitting the vote. How do you view her candidacy and her chances? What do you think her objective is in running?
Well, I think she is a spoiler candidate and she will split the vote. So I think your assessment, again, is spot on. And the frustration that is being exhibited by those in the community who are looking to vote for her is actually one that is not in denial of the fact that she could be a spoiler, and particularly on the side of adversely impacting Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, the Democratic ticket. But such is the frustration. If you listen to many in the Arab and the Muslim community who are voting for Stein, their entire rationale for doing so is to punish the Biden administration by way of the Harris-Walz ticket over what has transpired in the last 13 months regarding not just Gaza, but now spreading to Lebanon, the Lebanese American community also here in Michigan being quite sizable. They realize that it would be next to impossible for Stein to actually win the election, the popular vote, let alone the electoral college vote. But this is a way that they claim, or at least they contend, they are exercising their rights as citizens, and in the finest democratic process, they are then going ahead and providing a dissenting vote. What's troublesome, though, is it seems, however it might be intended, to be a rather myopic process, because as you well know, even if by some miracle Stein were to win the White House, she's going to have to contend with 100 senators and 435 congresspeople who are not from her political party. And if there is going to be then any kind of bipartisan consensus in Washington, it'll most likely be the Republicans and the Democrats joining together to make sure that her legislative agenda does not see the light of day. So all of these factors make for a rather grim view of the overall electoral process when you see how the dissenters' veto, if you will, could actually tilt the balance in a state that has a razor-thin margin right now between the two major candidates.
Saeed, you mentioned a bit earlier in your answer that many Arab and Muslim voters may vote third party to punish the Biden-Harris administration for its foreign policy. And I'm just wondering what you make of the lesser of two evils argument.
Well, I mean, if we are looking then at this election contest as a lesser of two evils, then we also have to concede as Americans that we are part of the hypocrisy ourselves, that this is the system that we have, and it is not something that evolved or devolved to this point overnight. But it also then suggests that if there is going to be some reform, then that reform has to come from within the current system. I think it's also important to recognize that the Muslim and Arab communities are not really necessarily ones to presume as being democratic. In fact, the immigrant Muslim community historically, at least until 2004, was fairly in favor of voting Republican for social conservative and fiscal conservative reasons, limited government, suspicion of government based in large part from them immigrating from countries where governments either were too corrupt or too oppressive. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, self-reliance was another major trope that they relied on that appealed to them as far as the Republican messaging. And then, of course, social conservative issues, traditional family values, a certain hesitation when it comes to the expansion of LGBTQ rights, made for the Republicans to be the more appealing prospect to immigrant Muslims. African-American Muslims tended to vote traditionally Democratic like the broader African-American community. But what we're finding is that 30% of the Arab vote went for Trump in 2020 here in Michigan. That is not an insignificant amount. Now we're finding that Jill Stein is polling about 1% nationally and about 4% here in Michigan. So on the one hand, it may seem very skewed when the Council on American Islamic Relations suggests that Stein is polling 42% among Arabs and Muslims in America. But given the population here in Michigan, despite it being sizable, still is only really polling 4%. Now, the problem is that that 4% is still within the statistical margin of error between Trump and Harris. So conceivably, it could make a difference.
Do you think at this point, at this stage in the day, that there are still undecided voters, uncommitted voters? Do you think that many will opt to remain home, stay home?
So those are four different options. There's Trump, there's Harris, there's third party, and then there's staying home. I think the pressure to not stay home is probably quite great now because this is an opportunity for people to actually cast a vote and show their agency and being a stakeholder. The third party situation, I think, is also very interesting because there is some data to indicate that when people do make it into the polling booth and they are confronted with the ballot and the gravity of everything, that maybe even those who seem to be rather stridently in support of Jill Stein as a third party just are too worried about the prospect of another Trump administration. And at that point, whether they hold their nose or not, will then cast a vote for Harris. So again, it really remains to be seen. There is, of course, the other possibility that Harris may win Michigan despite the Arab and Muslim vote not going for her. And if that's the case, then it really needs to be seen moving forward that if there is a President Harris, how much political capital will the Arab and the Muslim community really have when it would then be on the record that they did not show her support when it was critical.
Well, regardless of who wins, what do you see happening? I mean, do you expect the result to be contested? Are you concerned that there's a risk of political instability, a risk of possible violence?
That would be a yes to all of your questions. There is no doubt that there is going to be a contestation one way or the other. Teams have already mobilized in all the states, especially in battleground states, or what were seen as problematic states last time when Trump did in fact contest elections. There was the scandal of fake electors in places like Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So what we have now is no longer the shock and the surprise of how could this happen in America. There is the full expectation of that. Regarding if there are episodes of potential violence that are awaiting us, or even, God forbid, another January the 6th event, those are all within the index of possibilities. The idea of a certification issue may not be there because, after all, there is a Democratic president in the White House this time. That might provide some kind of safeguard, some kind of circuit breaker. But as 2020 showed, there are many things that prior to that could not have possibly been in people's imagination, but were. It's just that now, 4 years later, and having that as a precedent, that there is preparation for it.
Well, Professor Saeed Khan, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. That was Professor Saeed Khan, founding member of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. It's election day in the US, and today America and the world is watching who swing state Michigan decides to vote for. Joining me now is Hayg Oshagan, who is the founder and director of New Michigan Media, which is a network of ethnic media which aims to raise visibility of ethnic and minority voices in Michigan. He's also an associate professor in the Department of Communication at Wayne State University. Hayg, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I want to talk to you about earlier in the year in Michigan's Democratic primary, over 100,000 people selected the uncommitted option, many of whom had voted Democrat in the past. When we think about the changes of then till now, today Joe Biden is no longer the Democratic candidate. Vice President Kamala Herris is at the top of the ticket. What does that mean for those who chose the uncommitted option previously? What are the calculations, the trade-offs that they are thinking as they seek to cast their ballot today?
I mean, well, first, thank you for having me. It's a big day for the U.S. We are currently in a country that's polarized and divided in ways that it's not been before, and we'll see how it ends up. But back when the uncommitted vote became a movement, it was to really push the Democratic Party more leftward. Because the sense was that it had gone to the center too much. It wasn't just about the Arab issue. It wasn't just about Gaza. That was key, obviously, but it was also just in general to push it leftward in politics. At the time, Biden was the candidate, and as you mentioned, and even though 100,000 cast uncommitted, and that was seen as a substantial victory. In previous years, the uncommitted number was around 20,000. So 80,000 more people voted uncommitted. It wasn't seen as enough to really change Michigan from one side to the other. It was a message sent to the Democrats, essentially, to pay attention to these issues and to what people's concerns are. Since then, of course, it's Harris and not Biden any longer. I think there was some hope in the Democratic Party that would shift some of the concerns or take care of some of these concerns. I think it probably has a bit, but it's not clear really how much of a difference it's made, because the U.S. policies have not changed in many ways in terms of the areas that people were worried about, Gaza in particular. And so since policies haven't changed, and since she was the vice president during the time when the initial decisions were taken, nothing has been really done from the Arab perspective towards a ceasefire or stopping the war. People have lumped Harris along with the concerns they shared on Biden. So I'm not sure how much of it will make a difference. I think of the uncommitted, the official response for the uncommitted voters was, from the organizers, was to go and vote uncommitted again. So the sense is that it might be up to maybe 100,000 will vote uncommitted. My personal sense is that it won't be as many, partly because the original uncommitted was a message that was being sent. Now it's actually an election. Now actually someone's going to win or lose.
Right.
And I'm not sure. I think more people will just not vote rather than go vote uncommitted. I think that's likely how it will end up here.
Right. So what are your views on the third-party candidate, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate? When we think about the function of a third-party candidate in an electoral college system, how would that work? Are they potential spoilers? Are they potentially splitting the vote? What are your observations on this?
I mean, it's always been it's a two-party system, America, even though it doesn't have to be, but it's the structure, the system, the power is in that it's in the two-party system. So anyone who's running as a third-party candidate is very unlikely to win. The most they can do is maybe influence some policy issues, or influence potentially the outcome on a very, very close election. And so Jill Stein might be able to do that in Michigan, because some of the votes, some of the Arab and Middle Eastern and Muslim political organizations have endorsed her as a vote of protest, essentially. And some people might vote for her as a vote of protest. And so this might be an election where, if it's really close, if Michigan is within a percentage point or less, I think it might be that the Green Party or some of the other smaller parties might make a difference. But traditionally, they haven't had an impact on American elections.
Right. I want to talk to you about the importance of the Arab and Muslim vote, particularly in Michigan. Michigan is home to, 240,000 registered Muslim voters, a majority of whom voted for Biden in 2022. That helped him win over Donald Trump. And I'm wondering, this time around, how important is this voting bloc for the Democratic Party to put Harris in the White House again?
It's a complicated picture. There's no one simple way to describe the Arab and Muslim vote. There is a great deal of nuance in how people think about this. There's discontent, broadly speaking, anger about the way the U.S. policy has been regarding Gaza and Israel. In the Arab and Muslim vote, there's no question. There's tremendous anger and disappointment. On the other hand, it's not as if Trump's record while he was president was friendly with Arabs. I mean, the ban on Muslim countries was for Trump. The U.S. the mission in Jerusalem was Trump's doing as well. Very harsh line with Iran was during Trump's presidency. So there isn't, it's not an option. There's no option here for the Arab Muslim community that's very attractive. And a protest vote, for all it does, if it elects one or the other, it's not a solution either. So there's no, they find themselves in a very difficult place, I think. The vote is split, I think, in the Arab community. Traditionally, probably up to 70% of Arab Americans voted for the Democratic side. I think that's going to be less this time around. I still do think that the majority will vote Democratic. I think there will be a substantial no vote from the Arab community. Biden won the state of Michigan by about 150,000-60,000 votes last election year. Trump won it by about 10,000, 4 years before that. So if it's within 150,000, let's say, the vote, the Arab no vote or vote for Trump could make a difference there. It depends on how close it's going to be. The latest numbers I've seen is that it's essentially a tied race right now, that the two are even, Biden and Harris. But, Michigan is a big state. There are a lot of African Americans that live in the state, and they tend to vote Democratic strongly. If the Democratic Party is able to get out to vote with the African American voters, it's likely that Michigan will vote Democratic, regardless of the Arab vote.
Right.
If the other sectors of the Democratic base don't show up to vote in large numbers, then I think the Arab vote will potentially make a difference.
Right. Hey, if I may have you put on your New Michigan Media hat on for a while, also your Professor of Communications hat on, and assess the campaign, the communication during this campaign, and also tying that into the media coverage of the war on Gaza and the messaging around Gaza and U.S. foreign policy and its support for Israel. How has that essentially had an impact on conversations within the Arab American community? I understand it's not a monolith, but how has all of that in the past campaign period shaped voters' perceptions as they head to the ballot box?
Maybe 30, 40 years ago or more, there were limited news sources. You got your news essentially either from the major newspapers having correspondents overseas or television stations. It's not the case today. You don't need the New York Times or ABC News to get if you're an Arab American, you can go into Al Jazeera. If you're an Arab American, you have people back home. You can get on Nahar's website and see what the Lebanese news media is covering. And so there's no, as you said, it's not a monolith in any way in terms of the news space. And so people get their information where they want to get it from for Arab Americans. For non-Arab Americans, the information is, I think, primarily still from the major legacy news organizations that have correspondents in the Middle East that report on it. For the Arab community, they get their news from people back home. They get their news from Arabic news sources. They get their news elsewhere. The Arab American News, which is the newspaper in Detroit that is the dominant paper in this region, that's where their news sources come from. So the coverage that they're seeing is very different than the coverage that many of us, many non-Arab Americans see who rely on the traditional news sources. And so the type of coverage, whether it's pro or against Israel or Gaza, whether you call it a genocide or you don't, whether it's a ceasefire is what should happen or not, depends on who you are and where you're getting your news sources from. So the Arab community here has enough sources to be able to independently or separately have a view on what's going on other than what's covered in the mainstream media here.
Right. Hayg, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. That was Hayg Oshagan from New Michigan Media, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.